Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure and such a privilege to be here. And of course, one of the things that I admire with Mia is that she looks at phenomena and really studies phenomena from the basic up to really understand each part of it. And what I want to do is I want to mimic that kind of approach. Of course, in all modesty, I will never achieve the same deepness, but I want to mimic that with one aspect, and that is to look at active performance in entrepreneurs. And you were referring to personal initiative. I use the concept of personal initiative to understand what active performance means. But we'll look at that in a bit more detail. Just very, very shortly, I think Prof. Eden was the first one to ever talk about self-employed people. And after he wrote a paper on self-employed people, he and nobody else ever talked about that issue again in work and organizational psychology. I was very much interested in people who were not taking the normal career in companies. And one of the reasons why I was interested in that was because I was going to Africa quite a lot. And in Africa, I noticed that people did not have a normal career quite frequently. And so I thought, you know, where does psychology play a role here? What do we have to offer? And I found that there was one place where psychology could offer something, and that would be in actually understanding what entrepreneurship means. Because typically, if you have 80% unemployment in a country like Uganda at the moment, or some other countries in Africa, you typically ask the question, what kind of entrepreneurial career can I make? And that is often a necessity, and sometimes it's also opportunity. As it turns out, it's much more opportunity than people believe, and it's often more necessity in Western countries as well, but in principle, it does relate to the issue of thinking about exploiting and detecting and discovering and often producing opportunities, as Shane and Venkataraman have defined entrepreneurship. What I want to do is the following. I want to first convince you that different facets of active performance actually are related to success in entrepreneurs. That's the first sort of step. The second step that I want to take is that I want to convince you that you can change active performance and that you can produce a higher degree of active performance or personal initiative. And the third step is that this actually does increase also the success of entrepreneurs. So active performance is that you're self-starting, that you think about future opportunities and problems and prepare for them now, that you overcome barriers on the way to achieve it, and thereby you change your environment, often very small changes, but often also important changes. Reactive approach is, of course, the opposite, that you do what you're told, that you're oriented towards the now and not the future, and that you stop when difficulties arise. Now, self-starting, of course, does not mean that I do something completely out of the ordinary. I mean, that's sort of the hero stories of entrepreneurship, the kind of person who starts out in the garage and completely changes everything, okay? Now, that, of course, exists, but that's not the typical situation in which most entrepreneurs are. So what they do, though, if they're good entrepreneurs, is that they do not follow the trend, or not completely follow the trend, or that if they follow the trend, they improve on the trend. So they do not do exactly what other people are doing, okay? So self-starting is sort of thinking anew about the kinds of things that you do. And, you know, just think of any kind of business. and ask the question, what can you actually do in terms of self-starting in this business? And you will quickly find that there are in existence opportunities in pretty much every business. One of my favorite examples, I just give you one example, is hairdressing in Uganda. Okay? There's one hairdresser in Uganda who had the fantastic idea of having females as hairdressers of males. Okay? Now, you're not surprised about that. But in Uganda, people stand in line at this hairdresser because only male hairdressers do males, except in this one. This is an opportunity, okay? An opportunity that is sort of out of the ordinary in this particular environment, and we're talking about contextual opportunities. So you're not doing the obvious, and you think about future ideas, future problems, future opportunities, and you act for them now, and of course you try to protect your goals. Now, I'm walking through the action sequence. For me, the action sequence is a paradigmatic kind of, pretty much a heuristic approach of understanding what's happening in the actions of people. And so I start out with some kind of goal then I think of what kind of information do I need from the environment to actually achieve my goal. I plan for the goal. Often while I do the action, I monitor the execution, I get some feedback and change the goals. And of course this sounds so structuralist. There are all sorts of shortcuts and going back again in all of this. But if you use this as a sort of facet approach, so you have the self-starting, proactive, overcoming barriers definition here of active performance, and then you ask the question, what does it mean for goals? What does it mean for information collection? What does it mean for planning? I seem to have the wrong one here. Plan and execution. What does it mean for feedback? Then you sort of get a full facet model of what active performance might mean. And I'm going to walk through this a bit, and I'm going to go very quickly. So, and I essentially only walk through these aspects. So I'm not going to talk about personality, and I'm not talking about environment here in this particular case. Of course, they're important and they play a role. So let's first talk about personal initiative. It's related to success. It's also related to success when you look at it on the company level, for example, as a climate or culture kind of measure. And when you see that you indeed can predict performance of small to medium-sized companies with a climate for personal initiative, then you see the kind of effect that might have. There's also, of course, a meta-analysis on employee proactivity, and it's again a sizable correlation of personal initiative. But we are not concerned about employees at this moment. We are more concerned about entrepreneurs. The second one is a typical entrepreneur concept of entrepreneurial orientation, and it actually includes a number of these things that we talked about before. So, for example, proactiveness, but it also includes competitive aggressiveness, autonomy, risk-taking, and innovation. And again, there's good data that show that entrepreneurial orientation indeed is related and predictive of entrepreneurial success. I'm not going to go into this. Ed Locke was involved in some research on entrepreneurial goals and visions, and again, it is the growth goal. It's the goal that is sort of more oriented towards an active approach that are important and that leads to higher degree of venture growth. This is a study by Baum, Locke, and Kirkpatrick that was published. Now let's look at something which people do not typically look on in this area, and that is information search. So how do there's this idea that you walk around and you're overwhelmed by the opportunity. And actually in entrepreneurship research, that's quite frequent, that people sort of say it's a passive approach towards opportunities. You sort of see them, you know, without having to search for anything. Is that correct? You know, is that really the way we go about it? And so that's why we did a study. Again, it was done in Africa, in which we tested creativity, in which we tested how much was the active information search in people. And as you can see, we also tested opportunity discovery. So how good are you in discovering opportunities? How innovative are you when you think of these opportunities? And is that all of that is related to venture growth, yes or not?
What are these numbers?
Pardon me?
What are these numbers?
These are path coefficients. Path coefficients, yeah. So this is to hold constant a few controls like the industry that you're in, and then the other things are path coefficients in a full model, and it's a bit similar to the kinds of models that Ben Schneider showed. It's a mediated model with the creativity and active information search. Here it is an interaction between creativity and active information search that is in addition to these paths that we just described. And I just give you one example of that, if that works. Doesn't seem to. And this is the active information search. High and opportunity discovery is relatively higher if you have active information search that is high and you are high on creativity. So there's an interaction effect. That's the important thing here in the direction of increasing opportunity discovery. Now I have to find the right way. Now for me it was very interesting to look at planning in addition to goal setting, because planning has been a smaller brother or a smaller sister of goal setting, and there has been much less literature on how people plan. For me, planning implies everything that's related to how do I achieve the goal. So it may be very rudimentary kind of planning, or it may be detailed planning. It may be written down plans, or it may be non-written down plans. In the case of African entrepreneurs, you typically have, I just show you one example of an entrepreneur who we interviewed. So he had about 6,000 different parts for automobiles in his shack, and he was selling these and of course buying them. This person, I have to go back, and this person was measured in terms of how much was he planning, or how much does he elaborate the plan. And it's typically a plan that he has in his head, so he didn't write down the plan typically. So we did a relatively in-depth interview in which we sort of said, you know, how do you go about achieving this goal? And we talked about which kinds of goals that person had. And we are really in detailed, usually about 40 minutes it took us to actually understand the planning processes that people were providing, of detailed interviews and lots of prompting and lots of asking questions about it, to essentially look at two dimensions. How much is it elaborate, and how far along in the path do they actually plan? So do they plan only for the short term, the next station sort of, or do they plan the full system until they achieve their goal? The theoretical model was that elaborate and proactive planning was one that is related to both motivational resources and cognitive resources. The cognitive resources are primarily education and general mental ability were a little more important for elaborative and proactive planning, and also for one of the success factors, in this case size, the motivational resources, but I don't think that's the end of motivational resources. By the way, this is a sort of meta-analysis on 3 different studies that we used for a common path analysis in this case again. Just so that you get an impression, correlations are often, they look so small and puny, but when you look at the real effect that may have, and this is an example, they are much higher, are much stronger relationships in a way. Here we only take the really successful people in South Africa. We take those people who have a high reactive strategy. Of course, that's the opposite of high proactivity. And those people have a chance of 6% to be in the really highly successful group of entrepreneurs. If you have low reactive strategy, high proactive orientation, you have a much, much higher chance to be in this really successful group of entrepreneurs. So it matters a bit more than it sounds like when you look at the correlations only. This is a longitudinal study in which we also look at this cycle. I find that particularly interesting, to be quite honest, that there are cycles. So, for example, if you're proactive in your planning, you're more successful, but you also become more proactive in your planning, okay? And the other way around, if you're reactive, the opposite of proactive planning, you're less successful. If you are less successful, think of the of rigidity and the stress and strain that is related to non-success. You actually become even more reactive. You look more, what is the other person doing? You know, how can I emulate that person? But you are even less thinking about being self-starting or being long-term oriented or being overcoming barriers, and you have even less success as a result of that. So, similarly, social networks. I was a bit worried about some of the network literature because they were thinking about network in principle as structural places. You know, you either had them or you didn't have them, and you either had them as sort of part of where you were born, how you were born into a family that had good networks or not. And so, and that's particularly a strong idea, I think, in some of the Chinese literature, also on Guanxi, that people were essentially thinking of that as relatively structural networks that weren't changed. And again, it is the proactive performance orientation of entrepreneurs that changes networks. So people go out of their way to find the right people to actually understand them, to, in China, give them small presents, and to make sure that they go out for dinner and don't forget their birthday, etc. These are all active strategies of dealing with personal relationships. So there's proactive social relationships and relational perseverance that you need to actually have a good government network size, and that actually helps you a lot in China. By the way, it helps you a lot more in the provinces that are far away from the center. It doesn't help you that much in Beijing. So there's also a modernity factor here that is taking place. Okay. So the final thing is that I want to talk about is the issue of active approach to learning, and here I'm interested in the deliberative practice idea. And again, it's something that hasn't been studied in entrepreneurs, but you can, of course, study it in entrepreneurs as well as in anybody else. So how do entrepreneurs improve their skills? Do they sort of improve their skills where it hurts, where it's more difficult, or do they just sort of do the ordinary? And so one of the things that's actually difficult is to walk through the store and try to see things like a customer. That actually hurts, okay? Most entrepreneurs, because they find so many things that are wrong, that are not working so well. They try things out, do experimentation, or do they mentally simulate, or do they ask customers for feedback, and do they do professional readings. And again, of course, cognitive ability plays a role here in developing a deliberate practice and entrepreneurial knowledge. But the important thing is deliberate practice plays an enormous role for entrepreneurial knowledge, which again is related with firm performance. Again, these are African data from South Africa. Yeah, that's great. Now we want to change the whole thing, okay? So we use the same thing, this facet model that I showed you in the beginning, where we have the goals and the planning and the feedback and everything on here, and we have the overcoming barriers, the perseverance, and the and proactivity and self-starting here, and we developed essentially action principles from each one of those facets. So each facet was translated into what does that mean if you have to act as an entrepreneur. Then for each one we had an exercise, and for each one we often had a case study that was taken again from African entrepreneurs, examples of how they did it right or how they did it wrong, so that they would analyze essentially each facet. Now, we wouldn't tell them that this was the facet thing. We would tell them, this is on creativity, innovation, and etc. And it was, because of course self-starting has something to do with creativity and innovation. But of course you can't tell people we are going to walk you through the full model of personal initiative, and that will help you a lot. You don't find many customers that way. But whenever we found people who were interested in that, we sort of collected all of their addresses, and then we did a randomized controlled group design. So we had one group that got the training right now, and then we had a separate group of 50 people. It was 100 volunteers who were interested in training, and we had 50 people who were in the control group. Essentially, so we taught them how to set goals in an active way, to how to information search in an active way, how to do active and long-term planning, how to do active feedback seeking, etc. And we also did a lot of issues such as taking responsibility for everything you do, because that seems to be quite often a problem, that people sort of say, this is so much bad luck we have, that they reinterpret that as, if we change, we can change that. We can actually do something about that. We take responsibility for things that are not working out. And indeed what you see is that you see a strong relationship between the training and increase of personal initiative. That was personal initiative a few months afterwards. And now the big issue is, of course, is that also, does that translate into success? Now, there are two things that we need to do now. We need to first understand whether this group that was experimentally treated actually has more success. So that's the first thing. And that is indeed the case. They had about 2.5 more employees after a year. They had about 25% a higher profit rate at the end of that year. And one of the women who we trained actually became the entrepreneur of the year in the business journal of that country, Uganda. And as you see, the control group had a slight reduction of their success. But the more important issue is really now to understand whether it's fully mediated by this personal initiative training, whether people actually, whether it's particularly those who actually got a higher degree of personal initiative who are also successful. Only then can we determine whether it was the training that was the important thing. And indeed that was the case. I won't walk you through the numbers here, but you can understand that if you do partial out personal initiative, there's no more relationship between training and success, so it is fully mediated in this case by personal initiative. So training of personal initiative in this sense actually works. Now this is for me, and this is also my last slide. This is for me a good way of translating of understanding one thing, okay, one phenomenon. Of trying to understand it in real detail, of then translating that into action principles, of then teaching those action principles to people from a scientific point of view, and then seeing whether it actually matters. And the nice thing, it does matter. So if you do projections in the numbers, you know, if like half of Uganda would participate in the training, we can actually say, you know, so many new jobs are going to be created. Obviously, they will compete more vigorously with each other, so I know that there are also going to be a loss of jobs at some point in time. But the point is, from this bottom-up procedure, from this bottom-up type of change in developing countries, you can actually do a whole lot. And that's what I wanted to tell you. Thank you.